I remember the morning. It was a Saturday morning, if I recall. It was early. There was a knock at the door, and I went and said, like, "Hey, Dad, the police are here." Like, and then he's like, "What in the world?" So he goes and he steps out on the front porch, and I overhear him having the conversation with police, and they tell him that my mom had died in a car accident. I remember just being like, "Good riddance." Like, I didn't care. Like, it didn't faze me a bit. I remember my sister crying. And I remember my dad crying too, right? But I was just like, I had a heart of stone.
I want to introduce you to a man who, when I met, I saw a blessed man. He had an amazing marriage, an amazing career. But as I got to know him, I found out he came from a life of trauma. And what amazed me is because when I interacted with him, I did not see the ashes. I did not see the brokenness, but I saw a life that went from trauma to transformation, from trauma to triumph. And I want to introduce you to Gabe Clark to hear his story so he can give you just hope, belief, and actions that can actually change your life so you don't have to stay in the trauma victimhood loop, but you can live a life of victory. And so let me introduce you to Gabe Clark here.
Thanks for having me, man. Look forward to the conversation, and that probably a better intro than I deserve, but just look forward to sharing some of my thoughts
with your story. And I think this is where people emotionally connect. Oftentimes they hear these cliche phrases and it doesn't change their life until they know someone's been through the same journey they've been through. And I was just curious if you could just share your story about where it all began.
I'd be glad to. Yeah, I think a lot of times I use the phrase like, right, like you gotta play the cards you're dealt. And I recently heard somebody say, like, "Hey, that actually means something coming from you." So I appreciate that. My mom was a widow, so she had my two older brothers with a gentleman. He died in a motorcycle accident, right, which may be pertinent to like my mom's story if we get to that, right. And then met my dad after that, and then had me and my younger sister. But I really don't have any memories of my parents being together. Most of my childhood was spent with my mom, though I bounced back and forth, right? And there were custody battles that my mom and dad had over me and my younger sister. But my mom, right? I did the math on this. I should have prepped for this, but by the time she was 27, she was a single mom with 4 kids. And so and now that I'm a parent, I got 2 little girls, right? I'm just like, oh my goodness, that would be such a
you realize how hard it is after you have a kid. You're like, how did my parents do it?
I mean, it's like, and so that and that'll add some color to the conversation we have later. But my mom struggled with alcoholism and was super abusive. I mean, when she got drunk, and she was a raging alcoholic. Like, this wasn't like one of those like functional, like fun. It was like growing up, when we would come home from school, I remember it vividly. Like, the bus would pull up to our house. I would get up, walk towards the front of the bus, and I would wait to see if I could hear music playing from our house, because like if I heard music blaring, like I knew mom was on a bender, right? Because like what she would do is she would just get just ripping drunk, turn up the music, start cleaning the house, and then like the only thing you would have to do, like your heart would just sink, man, because like you knew that night was just gonna be awful, and so you'd try to like sneak in through the side door and try to slink up to your room without being caught. And then you would just try to wait the night out, which I mean, rarely happened, right? And so, I mean, my mom was like verbally abusive and physically abusive. I mean, some of the stuff we saw was pretty rough. Police were out to our house, I mean, multiple times. And so that's kind of like the state that I grew up in there. And because of that, like I had very little love for my mother. I had a desire, like I wanted to live with my dad, and I would often get to do that like during the summers and some school years. But what would end up happening there is like I would move back and forth. So I would like live with my dad for 6 months, and then my mom would insist that I come back home, and then I would. and I would go back and forth. And so I think between moving back and forth between my dad, who also traveled, he was a construction superintendent, so he was on various job sites, through the Midwest. I was in like 11 different schools, I think, like through high school, like when you add everything up. So there was one point, right, where I think this was in early middle school. I got to the point where the abuse had been enough for me, and I remember the night my mom had a boyfriend over, and he got into a verbal, I mean, just a screaming match with my older brother. Um, and I mean, long story short, my mom ended up punching me in the mouth and split my lip open. And I ended up going into the school counselor and just saying, "Hey, like this is happening at home." And they basically removed us from the home.
How were you like emotionally at that point as a
Yeah,
result?
that's a good question. I think at that point, like I was just so fed up with the the anger and the fear, and just like the instability, that like I didn't really care what happened. Um, I think
Mm,
that I spent much of my like childhood just like imagining a better future, just because that was kind of an escape for me. Um, and the other thing is like, I grew up in such instability that like chaos is like all I knew, right? So moving, moving back and forth every 6 months, it's like the fact that they were like pulling us out of the home and like trying to figure that out. I think we ended up moving in with my dad for a time during that time. That's another thing I'll say. Like, if anybody like fact checks all this timeline and they're like, "Hey, hold on a second," like my childhood is scrambled, man. Like I can tell you, like I've gone through and I can kind of give you the timeline by like, oh yeah, I was in this grade and so this would have happened. But like sometimes the details get all messed up. But I'm pretty sure like after that point, we either moved in with my dad or moved in with some cousins, which would be pertinent for my faith discussion. Yeah, but at that point, man, it's just like okay, it's like another piece of chaos. Like who are we gonna, like where are we going to be now? Like it's fine. Um, but then like during this time, okay, so that's kind of like what spurred like us moving out of the home and like being with my dad. And then I remember the morning. It was a Saturday morning, if I recall. It was early. There was a knock at the door, and I went and said like, "Hey, Dad, the police are here." Like, and then he's like, "What in the world?" So he goes and he steps out on the front porch, and I overhear him having the conversation with the police, and they tell him that my mom had died in a car accident. So she'd been drunk driving, and driving too fast and missed a curve, and died at the scene. And yeah, and I could tell you
wow.
like for me, like, and hopefully this just like paints the level of like hard heartedness that I had. Like I remember just being like good riddance. Like I didn't care. Like it didn't phase me a bit. I remember my sister crying, and I remember my dad crying too, right? But I was just like I had a heart of stone. So then, I think about is less than a year passes, and then there were some allegations that were brought up against my dad, and then we ended up being pulled from the home, um, and
Mm.
that basically started my journey in foster care. And so in the seventh grade, I entered foster care, and I was in foster care from seventh grade up through graduation.
Often what's most personal is most
Mm.
universal. And I think when we're in the midst of trauma and pain, we think, I'm the only one this is happening to. You start to shut down and disconnect from people to protect yourself. And it sounds like you were going through a lot of those phases that when your mom died, there was just no no emotions, no kind of grieving. You were
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I wouldn't say I was like if you there wasn't like joy about it. It really was just like cold heartedness. It was just like
yeah.
okay, fine. Like this is just like it was no love lost. And I would say like it's hard now. I certainly have gone through periods of grieving for my mom at this point, right? And I've forgiven her, and there really is like zero bitterness. I mean, like I was saying, like as I've gotten older, like, and I look at some of the things that my mom faced, right? Like we had a house fire where we lost everything when I was like 5 years old. And And if
Mm.
the family like folklore is right, like we didn't even have it. We didn't even have insurance on the house. Like when I say it was like a total loss, like we lost everything.
Oh,
Like we lived out of a motel for a period of time. And you know, when I think about that, when I think about being a single mom with like 4 young kids, and you know, it's like my wife and I, we've got, like I said, we've got 2 beautiful little girls. So my wife Olivia, my 2 girls Eliza and Evelyn, like we've got a hard enough time, like with the 2 of us being on the same team. Like I can't imagine my mom handling that.
I want to kind of summarize your story for what a lot of people are going through. You mentioned the adverse childhood events
Yeah,
assessment. And when people score higher on this for trauma indicators, that they're more likely to experience X, Y, and Z in their life. Can you share some of those statistics along with what happens to young men who enter the
yeah.
foster
So
system?
it's called ACE for short, right? But the Adverse Childhood Events Test, and basically what they found is like, hey, there's 10 questions about trauma that kids might experience in their home, and some of them are just like, I had a family member that went to prison, but some of them are like, you know, I was sexually abused, or like I watched my mother be abused, or I was verbally assaulted, or you know, you kind of go through some of those things, and as you accumulate more adverse events, like you're more likely to like have negative health effects. You're less likely to be like socially well adjusted. You're like less likely to be able to hold down a job. You're less likely to be able to get a college degree. Um, you're more likely to be incarcerated, right? Like there's just a number of these things that go along with that. And then like statistically, so I aged out of foster care, right? So at 18, you know, I was a ward of the state for a period of time. Then at 18, I was emancipated, and it's basically like, okay, like you're off into this brave new world. And, in foster care, like they do have like independent living courses where they teach you how to cook meals, they teach you how to like do a budget. But I mean, okay, I don't think that most high schoolers and college age kids are good with that to begin with. Like, even with like loving
Yeah.
parents who are like over them, like you ratchet it up to somebody who is like living in chaos mode. Um, and it's like they can't understand. They can't understand, like they can't learn how to cook a meal because they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about all of the stages required to like, oh, okay, like I gotta go buy pots and pans, like I go do this, I gotta go do that. So like when these kids age out of foster care, man, they're like they're 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 inept. I mean that sounds critical. They're just like they're woefully
Yeah.
unprepared. That's what I should say. They're like woefully unprepared.
When you're just thinking about surviving, you're not thinking about living and how to do
Yeah,
all
that's
that.
that's exactly right. And so I mean, so you can imagine like the statistics for like, and I'll say there, I say males who age out of foster care because while the statistics are not great for females that age out of foster care, like 2 points. Like one, I'm a male, so like those are the statistics that like you know matter to me. And two, like they actually like girls do perform better. They're more well adjusted, typically statistically coming out of foster care than males are. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but more likely to be incarcerated. Like most foster kids that age out, like it's like 3% of them end up getting a college degree. And I think that's 2 year or 4 year. Somebody can fact check me, but like we're talking like any sort of higher education of any type. In fact, you're like more likely to be a criminal than you are a college grad. I think like criminal, like 64% of males or something like that end up um, like incarcerated at some point. And so like the the odds that I faced like coming through some of those things um, were not good. I mean, to put it mildly.
Yeah. A zip code is one of the leading predictors of someone's financial success. So if they come from a zip code of poverty,
Mhm.
likely poverty is in their future. If they come from a rich neighborhood, they're probably going to do well off. Now, you have just described a zip code of brokenness. When did hope enter your story? Like what started to change your zip code to being blessed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two defining factors, and I'll say this, like as we have this conversation about like, hey, like what are actions or beliefs that you had, or like steps that you took to like reach a point of healing, I think it's really important to like sidebar two things. And like one is like, it's like the grace of God in my life, right? So I think a lot of these things that I've been through personally and the place where I am today, like is just a testament to like what God can do in somebody's life. And so I'll say a lot of things that like I did, but like I wanted to like always be with the backdrop of like it really was the Lord working through me and like the Lord's hand on my life because um, there's absolutely like zero chance I end up with the blessings that I have today if he hadn't intervened. So that's one. Two, I had like a lot of like really, really, really good people who sacrificed a lot for me and who loved me and like opened their home up for me and loved me when I was unlovable and gave me opportunities that I didn't deserve. And so like I am not a self-made man in that respect. Now, like there were plenty of things that like I had to do and I had to work through. Like I spent a lot of time in counseling. But like for me, like so zip codes, like from like broken to like blessed, right? Like two defining times stand out for me. And like one is the day that I accepted Christ. Like I remember my dad hid me with some cousins. We mentioned that earlier, right? Like my mom didn't know where these cousins were. Like so think about like how wild that is. Like he literally was like, "Hey, I need you to keep my kids for a little while," and mom had no idea. But they shared the gospel with me. They walked me through Romans Road, and like I always tell people, like I was a hellion growing up. Like got into a lot of trouble. I mean, I didn't have great supervision between my mom being at work or being drunk and my dad always being on the construction site. I mean, I lived in Fort Wayne, and my dad would check in on me like at lunchtime, and otherwise, like I was free to like run the streets. And so when they told me that like I'm a sinner, uh, and say, you know, like that, I'm like, oh, okay, yep, I like totally agree with that. And they were like, and there should be payment for that sin. I said, yeah, that makes sense. That checks, you know. But they said, but Christ has paid that for you. Um, and that is like my family had been to church some growing up. Like my mom would drop us off, but like that's the first time I remember hearing the gospel and the peace that I felt when I accepted Christ's payment for my sins. Like I think just like the weight of all the brokenness and like and just the hardness of life really melted away. And I think that was one part of it. I think from that point on, I kind of took this new posture. It wasn't a healthy posture, but it was like, okay, you know what? Like it was me versus the world, but now it's like me and God. Um, and then the second one was really with Dan and Martha. Those are my foster parents when I my junior and senior year of high school. And I won't belabor the point, but um, we didn't get along my first year. I was pretty hard headed and hard hearted, but they poured a lot into me. And I remember one afternoon them just sitting me down and telling me how much they loved me and how much leadership capability that they saw in me. And they offered to be my forever family if I wanted that. And I can tell you, like the next day, my heart of stone was melted. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it. Like I was a different man the next day because of that conversation.
I think it's amazing because God regenerated your heart. You're born again. And now begins the process of renewing your mind. Your mom was verbally abusive, speaking death and life
That's
are
right.
in the power of the tongue. But then these foster parents start speaking life, prophetic words of encouragement about your future, saying, "Hey, you're a
Mm-hmm.
leader. You're strong and courageous. You're a man of faith." And like at that point, like your trajectory of life changes. Like not in a moment, but like the
Yeah.
path.
I don't think I don't necessarily expect that to be for everybody, but for me it was like in a moment, man. I'm telling you, like the next day, it's really unexplainable. Which is why sometimes like when I'm asked to share my story and people say like, "Hey, like we would love for you to be an encouragement to other people who are going through what you did." I'm just like, "Man, like it's hard sometimes because I just had like a couple of like really really defining moments." Now, one, I think everybody has the opportunity to accept Christ and should, right? Like, again, like zero chance I am where I am today without him. But I just was blessed enough to have people continuously pour into me. And that's just the grace of God. And so it's hard for me
Yeah.
again. Like I think a lot about like what words of wisdom would I share? Like, and it's hard when it's just like, God was in control of this thing, man. But we talk about hope, right? And like and what I would say is like if you've been through brokenness, like there is hope. Like God can redeem even like the worst circumstances. Like my I had like one good thing going for me, right? And that was like my education. Otherwise, like I was bitter, I was hard hearted. Like I was smoking weed on a bus stop, like in the 8th grade. I was drinking my parents' alcohol, right? I hated my mother. You know, struggled with pornography. I had access to pornography at an early age, right? Like my life was off the rails, man. Um, and it's like, but it didn't happen overnight, right? But I'm living in the joy that God offers us. And so I think like just extending that to people,
Yeah.
like it's cliche, right? But like where you start is like not where you have to end. And it doesn't happen overnight. But God really can redeem any situation. I'm convinced of that.
I want to hit on this idea of you just shared a story of hope, transformation from trauma, from victim to victor. There's this parable, this story of a alcoholic man had two sons.
Mm.
You had an alcoholic mom. One son was like, my dad was an alcoholic, therefore I
Yeah.
am too. One son was not an alcoholic, and he was like, my dad was an alcoholic,
That's right.
therefore I am not. What were the beliefs that helped you continue this life transformation? Because Jesus says, then you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. I'm sure there was a lot of lies you had to break away from and truths you had to accept to actually walk in this transformation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, you know, I think the belief first and foremost, right, is that I have power over my life, right? I'm pretty bullheaded. I thank my mother for that. She had an incredibly hard work ethic, and she was very hard headed, and you know that that can go one or two ways. Every strength has a what do they say, like a balcony and a basement. So I try to use my hard headedness for positive things. Um, but like that was one belief that I had, is just that like I am in control of my life. And I had optimism that I did not want to be like my mom. If there's like any good that can come out of like um just some of the things I experienced, right, is that I was I was set on not creating that experience for my children. Um and and with my faith in God, right, I had hope that it didn't have to be that way. I could live obediently, um, and that he would, yeah, I mean he would take that over, and it would transform my heart. And I think like another thing is like just this belief that I'm just going to do the next right thing. Uh, so I don't know like where it's going to take me. I don't know, but I'm just gonna do like the next right thing, even if it's hard. If that's having my next conversation with my counselor, and it's um, opening up about a story that I don't want to talk about or that makes me feel uncomfortable, I'm gonna do that. And then as I matured, it was like for Dan and Martha, right? Like learning to let them love me, because that was probably my biggest challenge. Was again, I told you it was me versus the world, right? So it's like I appreciated them opening up their home for me and giving me food, but it really was just a convenience. I wanted nothing to do with them, and I didn't want them in my life. But then I got to this point, right, where like um, in some respects, like they were the manifestation of like the love of Christ to me, right? Like I couldn't push them away. They just continued to do that. So um, those were some of the beliefs. I mean, and there were some other things, right? Like I happened to be good at school, which was an area that gave me a lot of opportunities. I enjoyed education. I did have a work ethic. right? That drove me. I think all of these things kind of were beliefs that like ultimately steered me towards, um, towards health over time. And I've kind of boiled it down to like, right, I had like three things that like are kind of my mantra, right? It's like hope, acceptance, and agency. Like those are like the three pillars for me that like when I look back on my life, right? It's like I knew things could be different. I accepted where I was, and then I ultimately believed that I had the power to change like where I was going.
Okay, so hope, acceptance, agency. And you spoke to it a bit of what ignited hope in your heart, being Jesus and
Yeah.
your foster parents. When you talk about acceptance, how did you accept your past? I think it's about accepting your past and agency for the future. Is that
Yeah.
what you're
So
getting
for
at?
me, like acceptance is this idea of just like being neutral with the things that have happened to you. So maybe that's not the greatest definition. I just mean like it's okay to grieve. Like sometimes it's still sad for me that I didn't have the childhood that some of my friends have had. I'm sad at times for my girls that they don't like, both my parents have passed away at this point, and they don't have grandparents, right? That they get to experience. I don't have my little Eliza. She loves like one of her favorite things that she says like, hey mom, hey dad, can you tell me about a story when you were a baby? And like I've got like none. I've got like no good stories to tell. And so that's sad. But for me, the acceptance is this idea that's like when I look across the history of mankind and I consider the plight of man, like why do I feel like I'm entitled to some like life that's free of suffering? I'm not, right? Like I mean, even the things that I experienced, like were they ungodly? Like, yeah, like were they painful? Yeah. Like, is it worse than like what humans have experienced like throughout the course of history? Like, no. Like actually like it is like well within the bell curve of human experience. And so I think you just like get to this point where you're just like, okay, like I'm not gonna let bitterness reign in my heart. Like these things happened, but I'm not a victim. I mean, it wasn't right that my mom did those things, but I really do like I'm at the point where like I think she was doing the best that she could. And
No.
could she have made different decisions? Like, yeah, like I wish she would have. But she didn't. And like I can either like sit in that mire and say, "Oh, woe is me." Like I would, I'm not. Nobody's going back to change it. So like, what are we gonna do? Like, there's
Yeah.
immense opportunity ahead of us, right? And it's like, and so I can, again, I can sit in unforgiveness and I can sit in bitterness and I can be mad at the world, and I can, continue to push people away who want to love me and be a blessing in my life. I can reject the mantle of fatherhood, or like do a poor job at it and continue to perpetuate the cycle, or I can say what's done is done, and we're gonna change it going forward.
I liked a LinkedIn post you shared recently about acceptance. I I stopped looking about what was right and
Mm-hmm.
fair, but what was right and real. I think that perception of fairness, like this injustice happened to me, only leads to bitterness. Um, but when you look at right and real, like this happened, it allows you to forgive because I've been
Yeah.
forgiven by Jesus and move on. Um, and I thought it was interesting what you said about memories. Like, I don't have a lot of memories of my childhood. I was reading this book by Dr. Carolyn Leaf, and she approaches the mind from a scripture and science perspective. But when the mind is under a lot of stress, it prevents the mind from storing short term
Mm.
memories to long term memories. And so, people who go through trauma and stress, I went through years of addiction to pornography in high school, and I don't remember my childhood because all that stress and sin prevented me from forming memories and connections with people. And it wasn't until I found restoration, redemption, and forgiveness in Christ, where now I'm able to start forming memories. And I don't have to be traumatized by my past because I have a promising future. This idea that a man who has no vision has no future, and a man with no future always returns to his past. And when Jesus enters in and he gives you hope for a future, then you can start to change. And I think this is where I want to transition my next question about agency, because in the Christian faith, oftentimes there's this idea of providence. God orders everything. But God could not hold us accountable unless we had the free will of choice. And so what you're defining as agency, control, and choice, can you speak to that more? Because I think it's powerful.
So to me, I think in many respects, like especially in the Christian faith, I heard somebody use this phrase, and I really appreciated it. It was, they said, you're cooperating with grace. And so for me, like I definitely believe that the Holy Spirit, like when I talk about, hey, I'm taking the next right steps, I don't think I came up with all of those on my own, right? I think I was sensitive to the directing of God through the Holy Spirit to just say, like, hey, Gabe, like, this is what you need to do. This is where you need to go. This is the next healthy thing for you to do. And like the agency for me is just this idea. It's like, well, no, I do have power in my life, right? I mean, it's kind of philosophical, right? But I believe in this idea of like the natural law. And I think this would be within the Christian tradition, right? Where it's like, I think God's economy, like if you want to call it that, like just as we're governed by physical laws, I can't jump off my roof as much as I want to. And like, because gravity will have its effect on me. I think God talks about this too, right? That like, don't be fooled. A man reaps what he sows. And so for me, like when I think about agency and like having control over my life, it's like, I'm going to make the decision that like, regardless of what's been planted before me, I'm planting new seeds. And I have the right to do that in my life. And I have the authority to do that in my life. And by the grace of God, I'll have the strength to do so. And if you spend enough time like plowing and planting seeds, like eventually you see good fruit from that. Right. But I think it's hard to accept, or I think it's hard to adopt a mindset of agency, or you might call it like extreme ownership, if you haven't accepted like the hand that you're dealt. Because if you haven't accepted the hand that you're dealt, then I think you're still in this like victim mentality. You still believe that the world is happening to you. You still believe that like you're a product of your circumstances, which in some respects we are, right? Like we pick up junk as we're going. But like once you accept, like, okay, like that is what it is. I'm going to extend forgiveness. Like that puts you in a position to say like, but I get to go change that now. And I've got the responsibility for like, my progeny, for my future spouse or current, like depending on where you are and like your journey through like healing, like, and you've got an obligation to like, I think, right. Like for the glory of God, like I kind of look at it like, this is a little bit weird, right? But it's like, like like if I've been saved, like I owe it to like God Almighty to make his name great. And one way that his name is made great is through like great stories of redemption and through his power. And so like maybe that doesn't quite fall under agency, but that's another motivating factor.
That is so good. And I want to take this thought of agency to action. So Megan and I have this phrase of, you can't just run from something. You have to run to something, because ultimately what you behold, you become.
Yep.
And I base it out of like 2 Corinthians 3:17. As we behold the glory of the Lord, we're transformed from one degree of glory to another. And also Matthew 6, the eye is the lamp of the body. If the eye is healthy, the whole body will be healthy. But if the eye's on healthy, so forth. What actions can people take today to start transforming their lives from trauma to triumph?
Well, I think first, right, if you're not walking with God, if you've not surrendered your life to the sovereign King, then that's, to me, that's step number one. I mean, there is the world has a lot of opinions about what healthy looks like. The world has a lot of opinions about self care and what you deserve. And I unfortunately think a lot of them run contrary to where I have found health. And I think we can oftentimes obsess over our problems instead of just laying them in front of God. And so I would say like twofold. Like one, like if you're curious about the faith and you haven't quite made a decision, like let me tell you, like Jesus wants to take your burdens. And he, like, I mean, first off, like you got to recognize, I think this comes back to like the acceptance part, is that like it's easy to accept like other people harming me when I realize that I'm a sinner and I've offended God. And then accepting the gift of Jesus Christ, for my salvation. And then I think from that, right, like then I've got an opportunity to like just fully surrender my life to Him and say like, God, I don't know what this looks like going forward, but my life is yours. And like all of my desires and my wants and the ideas and the plans that I had for my life, like I want those to like fall in line with like what your desire for me would be. I want to just like, kill that old man and crucify him. And I want to move forward now, like just loving and following you. I think that's first, hands down. Um, I think for some people, like it might be professional counseling. Like if they're wrestling with a lot of trauma and hurt and brokenness, I had to spend years going through counseling. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I don't think it shows weakness by any means. Um, and for some people, like may not need it. It was really, really necessary for me. I think too, just because it helps me put words to a lot of the things that I'm feeling. It helped me increase my like emotional intelligence, which is hugely helpful in my marriage. Right, especially coming from like a broken background where I didn't have good good like marital skills or practices, right, like in front of me. And so like we're crafting those on our own. And guess what? Like sometimes I screw up and sometimes I get frustrated, sometimes I get angry. Um, but and yeah, but I don't have all this emotional baggage to sort through. Like when Olivia and I are having an issue and we're sorting through that, um, she doesn't have the like unpleasant task of dealing with all of that garbage, because it's been sorted through. Um, I, as far as other actions, man, I mean, I really think those are big ones for me. Um, Thinking about this conversation, I was just like, this one doesn't necessarily fall in action so much. Maybe it falls in belief. Uh, I think if you're in the process of looking for a relationship and you're looking for a relationship because you think somehow it's going to correct your, your relationship with your parents, or like, I'm going to go like make a family that I never had. I think people need to be careful with this idea that, a relationship is not going to complete you. A relationship isn't going to heal you, right? Like, I, I really think part of the reason why we have a blessed marriage is because I dealt with a lot of that crap, before I got into it. I'm not saying that's the be all end all. I'm just saying like, 'cause I think people can come into relationships with baggage and have perfectly healthy relationships as they sort through those. No one's perfect. God continues to grow us and sanctify us. I think it's coming into the relationship with the belief that like my family was broken, but but this relationship is going to complete me. Like, I really think you got to find wholeness before you enter there.
100%. Megan and I on our YouTube channel about healthy dating, healthy marriage have been preaching that you don't want to date for wholeness,
Hmm.
but from wholeness. You don't want to date for love, but from love. And I think there's this narrative in culture, the Christian and secular dating realm, that I'm going to date to be made whole. But I think in your story arc, you went from no family to forming a family. And that idea that we're orphans, sin, orphans, separated from God, but Jesus dying on the cross adopts
Yeah.
us into the family of God. So if we get that settled as our foundation before we form a family, it's so critical.
No, that's totally right, man. And then I think there just were a lot of little things from an action perspective. Like, we got like really, really, really good at budgeting. That was something that mattered. I had nobody teach me financial skills growing up, and money problems like those cause like serious marital stress and problems, right? And so I think like that was something. I said already said counseling, like, um, and then I think really just having um, good, genuine friendships, which I wasn't able to form. I formed a ton of like just shallow friendships, partly because like again I moved around a lot, so I got really good at making friends quickly, but then being ready to shut those relationships down because I know that I'm leaving in 4 months or 5 months. Uh, and so I had a really good like facade, and so learning how to form like honest, just genuine, deep relationships and being vulnerable. Um, well, and we were having this conversation earlier, right, about like the fear of failure. Um, and it's like really getting over the fear of hurt. Um, and just saying like, I mean, like good things only come when we take risks. And that comes like with our finances and with our relationships, and like professionally, all of these things. Like if you're not taking risks, if you're shutting things up and you're not exposing them to, um, you're not exposing them to like potential harm, right? They're not going to grow. So
Gabe, I really hope people listen to your story in its entirety. Because when I first met you, nothing would indicate your beginning. Nothing would indicate your brokenness. And I think this conversation truly gives hope, gives belief, action that their life can change. Their life can be better than the beginning. Like you said, the beginning of your story doesn't have to be the end of your story. You can turn a new chapter in Jesus by surrender. Like that was your
yeah,
first
yep,
item that you said, surrendering to Jesus, which we view surrender as such a weak word, but that's the starting place of transformation, giving your life in surrender to Jesus. So, any final thoughts that you would share with someone?
yeah, man. I think I covered. I think I covered most of it. I mean, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share just what God has done in my life. I do hope, right, that somebody listening that is maybe wrestling with bitterness or unforgiveness, whether that be with a parent or somebody near to them who was supposed to love them and take care of them and didn't, that they would come to the point where they could find um, you know the ability to forgive them, which again I think only comes through our understanding of like how God has loved and forgiven us. Because man, like that bitterness that you carried around, I carried that bitterness like for my mother for a long time, and it's a poison. And there are so many good things uh, and good opportunities available to you if you just let that go. And I talked a little bit about like God's natural law, and it's like th- this sounds self-serving, but just like hear me out. Like nobody likes being around like a bitter person. Nobody likes being around people who are unkind. Nobody likes being around people who are pessimistic. And so like really like some of these postures that I held or that I have held at different times in my life, like it's self-sabotage, right? It's like some of these ways that God has called us to live. Um, like he tells us to be joyful and and have love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control, right? Like the fruit of the spirit. Like it's amazing how attractive those things are to other people, right? And so like when you're like rebuilding your life after trauma, like just putting some of these things into place, like bring you like genuine friendships. They bring you genuine opportunities. They create stability in your life. And it's like, oh wow, that's kind of like funny that God designed it that way, right? And so yeah, just like um I'm an open book, man. If like somebody's listening to this and they're like, man, I would love to just talk to Gabe more about that or hear more about his story, right? Like I'm easy to find. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. Um, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Like, but yeah, I just would implore people, like what I'd leave people with is like surrender your life to Christ. Right. Like there's no, I mean, even if you didn't come from trauma, right? Like there is no deeper joy that you'll experience. And if you did come from trauma, right? Like there's true healing in that. But conversation doesn't have to end here. You can reach out to me and find me on my social media channels.
Awesome. I love and admire this man, Gabe Clark. I'll drop a link down below for his LinkedIn and Twitter so you can find him. An excellent man who's pursuing Jesus, who went from trauma to triumph, from generational trauma to generational triumph, because he's leaving a legacy with his wife for his two daughters. And you can have that too. You can go from no family to family in God, to having your own family that's full of love, hope, and joy. Catch you guys next time.